This is the third part of a discussion of Javier Zubiri's Man and God, the first part of the book, Chapter 1, Section 1, where he reviews his metaphysics of reality. And what I want to do in this talk is highlight some of the key ideas we heard in the first two parts and draw this discussion to a close before we move on to specifically Zubiri's understanding of human reality. A key idea that we picked up last time was the idea of respectivity. That remember, every real thing is a constitutionally sufficient unified system of notes. Each note is what it is with respect to every other note of that system. In other words, in every other note of that thing. And each thing, each substantivity, as he calls them, is what it is with respect to every other substantivity, every other unified system of notes. So an important implication of this is the idea of relationships. Relationships, as we'll see as we go further in the course, are going to be very important. According to Zubiri, relations or relationships are contingent. Any two given substantivities, thing one and thing two here, sound a little like Dr. Seuss, can form relations with one another. They need not, but they might. Respectivity, on the other hand, is structural, or another philosopher might call it ontological. It's a feature, a structural feature of all real things. It's not a choice, certainly not a conscious choice. Relations are founded upon this structural feature of all real things, which is respectivity, contributing to what Zubiri calls the openness of the real. So for him, there's only one world. There can only be one world. He discusses in this section how there might be actually multiple universes, the way our most up-to-date cosmologists like to think about things. But there can only be one world. And what is that? The respective unity of all realities. The unification of all realities as such with respect to each other. There's only one world. All realities are, or have, as he puts it, actualness. In other words, everything that's real has this feature of being in act rather than in potency, as the Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics would talk about it. Think about this for a second. What's act? What's potency? Act or actuality is what I am now. Potency is what I might be. I'm not in potency to every possible thing, but I am in potency to certain things. And a thing can't be both in act and in potency in the same way at the same time. So to give you an example, at the moment, my daughter is actually an attorney. But when she was 12, she was actually a preteen in school and only potentially an attorney. But now that she is actually an attorney, she's no longer in potency towards being an attorney. She is an attorney. She is in potency to being other things, for instance, maybe a university professor someday. But you can't be both in act and in potency at the same time. Now, what that means in this situation is that every real thing has an actualness about it. It is in act. It's not potentially in act. It's in act. The Spanish language has two verbs for to be. If you know Spanish, you know this. You learned it day one in your Spanish class or your language class. Ser is a form of to be, and estar is a form of to be. And ser is kind of a being. Yo soy un hombre. I am a man. Actually, I'm not in potency towards being one. I am one. But what Zubiri calls actuality is what he means by the being here now, the thing as a phenomenon, as a showing up, as it appears. And the Spanish word for that would be more like estar, like estoy en casa. I am in the house. That's where I show up. That's where I happen to be at the moment. I might be somewhere else later. So my actualness is permanent, so to speak, until I disappear from this reality. But my actuality is something that's changing. It's in flux. How my actualness manifests itself shows up differently at different times. And I hope that makes some sense to you. That Zubiri uses the example of a germ. We could use the novel coronavirus that we're all dealing with at this moment. The novel coronavirus always had actualness. It was there somewhere. Once it eventually arose, it had actualness, even though it had no actuality for anybody. No one noticed it. It hadn't affect anybody. It didn't show up. It didn't appear. It was real. It was no less actual for not having shown up. But now that it's shown up, its actuality has been momentous. It's caused a lot of health and economic and political problems throughout the entire world. So actualness is sort of a basic feature of all real things. Actuality is how each of those real things will show up. That's going to apply to all real things, and very importantly for us, it's going to matter to us what our actuality is. Actuality, the showing up, the phenomenon, the being here now, the estar version of to be, derives from what Zubiri calls the functionality of the real. Now, the word function, you have to understand what he's talking about. Like I have a computer and it has certain functions. That's not quite what he's talking about here, like the functions of a coffee cup or the functions of a computer. Things are what they are and show up the way they do because of the openness of the real and respectivity as a function of other things, perhaps as a function of everything. So you have to hear the word in that sense. He's not talking about something mechanistic, so to speak. He's talking about the fact that things are what they are. Their actuality, the way things appear, is a function of everything else appearing the way it appears. It's a function of that. It's with respect to that. It's open to all of that. And again, it's something we're going to have to keep in mind when we move to the next section of this book, where he talks about specifically human reality. And causality, you might think, is equivalent or synonymous with functionality, but Zubiri says, no, there's not. I mean, that's it. Some things show up because they have been caused to show up, but there are other kinds of functionality in the sense that Zubiri means it. For instance, he gives seriality, which means one thing after another. And I hope you know that that's not the seriality can't be the same as causality. For instance, yesterday I had a turkey sandwich, and then later, after that, yesterday, the Phillies won a baseball game in extra innings. First I had the turkey sandwich, later or next, the Phillies won a game in extra innings. But I don't think you would think, and I didn't think, that my having had the turkey sandwich caused the Phillies to win that baseball game, right? That's not what we mean by causality. Just because something comes first, it doesn't mean it caused it. But if you think about it, when I had that turkey sandwich, first I put mayo on the bread, and then later I had a turkey sandwich. But having a turkey sandwich is in part a function of having put mayo on the bread. If I had not gotten out the bread and put mayo on the bread, there would not be a turkey sandwich. Putting the mayo on the bread doesn't cause there to be a turkey sandwich. You might say, I caused there to be a turkey sandwich, but that's an instance of seriality. The turkey sandwich is a function of the prior opening up of the bread and getting it out and putting the mayo on it. So things are what they are, not just because they've been caused to be a certain way, but they are what they are as a function of other things. The preview, we are what we are as a function of other things. That's what we're going to need to talk about when we talk about liberation. Now, I just want to remind you again, because it's very important, and eventually we're going to get back to this when we talk about human reality. These two Spanish words that we talked about earlier, teologal, which is what Zubiri is trying to do in this book, and teológico, which Zubiri is not particularly interested in doing in this book. Take the second one first. Teológico, remember, is to talk about things, even human beings, especially God, in terms, for example, of a Christian or other religious tradition or doctrine. And again, Zubiri uses a lot of Christian examples in his book, but that's just all they are to him. He mentions them only because he believes his readers would have been familiar with those kind of examples. He wasn't speaking or writing for, especially in those days, a readership that included a lot of Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists or whatever. He says he could easily have given examples of those religions, but he just didn't. Right? He doesn't deduce anything in this book from those specifically Christian and Catholic religious doctrines. He just uses them to illustrate what he and we, he argues, can get to philosophically and empirically without reference to those doctrines. All right, so that's Theologico, is theology class. That's what you do somewhere else. Zubiri says, no, what I want to do is get at something about us humans, the theologal nature, or more specifically, dimension of human reality. It's something fundamental, it's necessary, it's inescapable, it's part of what makes us, in fact, it's the core of what makes us the kind of realities that we are. This dimension, our inner expressed into the outer, that's what he means by dimension. He wants to reserve that word theologic, right? Not theology class, but theological. In this sense that it's not it's not a set of doctrines, it's a feature or a structure of what it means to be human. And he says, to do theology, theologico, to do that requires accepting or adopting some kind of theory. And for Zubiri, as I mentioned before, theory is something he wants to try to stay away from, at least as he defines theory. For him, a theory is some pre-given thought system. And what you do when you have a theory is you try to make observations fit your pre-given scheme, and any observations that don't fit that scheme you try to ignore or to downplay. So for him, theology would be a great example of a theory. You would have this already formulated Christian set of lenses through which you see the world. And they allow you to see it in a certain way, but not other ways. And I think you can tie that to what Eyakuria was saying about about the word ideology. Ideology, remember from that discussion of Eyakuria, has both a positive and a negative connotation. The positive connotation is like theory. It's a system of thought that allows you to see the world hopefully clearly. It becomes negative when that system or those lenses prevent you from seeing the world clearly, prevent you, become an obstacle to seeing the world as it really is in the best light. So theory lends itself to becoming ideology in the negative sense, and Zubiri says, I want to try to stay away from that. I think what he's doing, and this isn't in the text, I'm adding this in. If you happen to have taken the moral foundations with me, we read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and we talked about the activity of the soul in accordance with the highest virtue, and we said that the name of that activity is theoria. It gets translated as study or contemplation in the English translations, but it's really about what our nous, what our minds, what our souls, if you want to put it that way, what our reason can see about reality. See not see with the eyes, but in the sense of understand. Like when somebody explains something to you and you say, "Oh, I see what you're talking about." You're not having a visual experience. You're getting it, right? And I think what Zubiri is trying to say is, if you work philosophy alongside of him in this book, you're not picking up a theory from Zubiri and then applying it. Especially not picking it up uncritically. He says, just walk along with me and try to see what you see. That's theoria. That's your mind, your intellect at work, trying to see what can be seen about human reality. And he thinks when you do that, what you're going to see is this theologal dimension of what it means to be human and all the things that implies. So again, as promised, I'm reviewing it now, but I will also mention it again and again before we're done talking about Zubiri. Now, I hope that you're starting to develop a little bit of a vocabulary list. I hope you will. And so let me just run down a few of these terms that we've hit just to make sure that they're on your radar. First, a real thing, is a constitutionally sufficient unified system of notes. Notes are anything that you can note about a thing. The notes form a systematic unity. There is a sufficient number of notes to constitute this thing as an autonomous substantivity, as he calls it. That's what counts as a real thing. Those notes are not pin-cushioned in to some substrate, some underlying something or other that seems not to have its own features. That's what the tradition calls substance. So if you look a little further down the list, substance, that's what the tradition thought was the really real, and properties somehow were pin-cushioned or inhering in those substances. For Zubiri, a thing is a substantivity, a unified system of notes. The of is the unifier. There's no underlying something or other that the notes are connected to. It's the notes themselves. The notes are anything that you can note about a thing, and they are what they are with respect to every other note, and each substantivity is what it is with respect to all other substantivities. We had these two terms, constitutional versus constitutive. All your notes, all of my notes are constitutional. That's what makes me. That's what makes up me. Every little thing about me are the notes that constitute me. They're constitutional. Some of my notes, though, are constitutive, and what he means by those is, if you took those away, I'd be something else. Some of my constitutional notes are adventitious, which means they happen to be that way, but they might not be that way. My weight today, my weight tomorrow, whatever my weight is on a given day, that constitutes the me that I am. But having one weight versus another weight is not in itself constitutive of me. But my genetic material, in the case of me, would be a constitutive note. That's one that makes me the substantivity I am and not something else. Reality for Zubiri has this quality of otherness, the desuyo, the in its own rightness. Something is real if it is in its own right, not just because somebody says so or thinks so, but because it is in its own right. We talked already about the theological versus theological. We'll say more again. You can see the previous slide. Again, this idea of dimension, everything about me, the inward part of the systematic unity of my notes, is not hidden from the world. It's not separated or isolated from the world. All those notes that collectively make up me are also expressing themselves out into the world and interacting with respect and as a function of that world. That's true of me, you, and all real things. Rock, stones, planets, trees, cars, everything. We reviewed in this presentation respectivity, which is a structural feature of every real thing, versus relations, which can be, but not necessarily are, formed between substantivities and built on the structural feature of respectivity. If things weren't respective, there could never be relations. Think of it that way. If things did not have respectivity, relations would not be possible. Function for Zubiri, it is not like a mechanistic working. It's more related to this idea of respectivity. Things are as a function of everything else. Things are with respect to everything else. And that functionality and respectivity of the real constitutes what he calls the openness of the real. The reality is open in the sense of open to every other element of reality. And then this final idea that we introduced in this talk, actualness, following on the Spanish word ser, the to be, that talks about the very nature of something, versus actuality, the Astar version of to be, which talks about how one being happens to be situated at one time versus another. Actualness is, again, an inescapable feature of any real thing. All real things are actual in the sense of actualness, but not all things have actuality because not all things arise or appear. And we'll have to talk specifically about how actuality itself arises, and we won't be able to do that without talking about human reality. That's going to be important. So All of this, everything about this is de suyo. It's in its own right. This is not based on some kind of pre-existing theory, according to Zubiri anyway. It is autonomous, a respective autonomy. Things are this way with respect to the way everything else is, and we can simply observe it if we set our minds to it. And then where he's going to go with this, and this will be the last point of this little talk as far as something new. This in its own rightness, this de suyo, he's going to say has three moments. Right? Another way of putting it, reality has three moments. Reality gives itself in three simultaneous kind of expressions. Real things have what he calls just a kind of a naked reality. And that maps onto this Greek idea of physis, which is what where we get our word physics from. Physis got translated into Latin as natura, where we got our word nature from. And it means a kind of burgeoning forth, a kind of a growing, a springing forth up from the ground. Things just are. They have actualness. But then he says, but there's more to it than that. The things that are, but they are and are manifesting a kind of forcefulness is the word he used. And what he means here is things don't just randomly kind of go this way and that way. If you look around the world, there's a kind of necessity to how reality manifests itself in its own right. Again, not just from your angle or your perspective or your way of looking at things. Things have a certain pattern to them. Things have a certain structure to them. They're not any which way. And because that's so, we're going to see human beings who have a particular kind of access to reality. He calls it sentient intelligence, and we'll talk about that. Human beings are able to undertake the task of what we call science. We can encounter the force of nature, the necessity of nature, that it does work in certain regular or patterned kind of ways. We didn't just make that up. That's the way it is. That's the way reality is in its own right. And then he wants to say, which is more to it even than that, there's a certain kind of powerfulness of reality, an overpowering is more like what he's talking about here, that makes reality ultimate, that there's no outside of it in any meaningful sense, that it's kind of the last resort, and reality drives us to do things, but it makes certain things possible and impossible for us as well. There's reality is structuring us, driving us, making things possible for us, preventing things from us because of its necessity in part. And we are going to be the realities that deal with these three moments of reality. Everything is an expression of these three moments of reality, but there's something about humans that can grasp reality in its own right. And reality in its own right has these three moments, and we can grasp them. And that third point there, the powerfulness, is going to be the well springs or the roots of religion. Just like the forcefulness of reality constitute the roots of science. Okay, so Zubiri is going to try to tie all of this together for us, but before he can do that, he's got to walk through what all of this has meant when it comes to us. Now, I recognize that this first section is compact and it's pretty challenging. Man and God is this first part of Man and God that we've just been talking about in the last couple of lectures. It constitutes a review of ideas that took Zubiri several books and numerous cursos to kind of lay out. It's a summation, it's a compact summary of his metaphysical ideas. And if we had all the time in the world, if we didn't have other things to do, this course, we could probably unpack it some more. But I just want you to see, because we have to understand the rest of what he's talking about, the gist of what his understanding of reality is. The key takeaway, if there's one, is the idea of the respectivity, the functionality, the openness of the real. That is not something that's any being, including human beings, choice. It's a feature of what it means to be real. And you could not be the substantivity you are, the real being you are, without the functionality and the respectivity and the openness of the real. You are what you are as a function of everybody and everything else. Same goes for me. You think, well, no, I want to be what I am without respect to everybody else. And Zubiri's going to argue, and this is where it has political and ethical import, that can't make sense in the long run. It can't make sense. And what's interesting is there's an awful lot of moral philosophy and political philosophy that thinks that you can make sense of that idea of thinking about us human beings as isolated individuals, of defining autonomy in the sense that I'm an isolated individual. And Zubiri is going to say, autonomy? Yes. Isolated individuality? Not really possible in any kind of metaphysical sense. So that's something that's important to know and that we're going to have to come back to, and we certainly will come back to it. So let's take a break, and we'll start in with the second chapter next time.